At 0317 hours on July 12, 1943, some 300 nautical miles east of Newfoundland, the North Atlantic was a cauldron of cold steel and liquid ice. U-570, a Type VII C submarine, the workhorse of the Kriegsmarine U-Boat fleet, was at a depth of 180 meters, well below the recommended safety limit, yet not deep enough to escape what was coming next. The attack didn't come as a single blast, but as a series of sonic hammer blows that seemed bent on inverting the ocean itself. The first thunderous impact to 50 meters away, misaligned panels, shattered lamps, and ripped chunks of insulation free. The second, almost directly above the hull, sounded as though a giant had struck the U-boat with a 10-ton hammer. It was convoy SC-134, hunted and now retaliating. The escort destroyer HMS Harvester had located U-570 and was determined not to let it escape. In the small, cluttered engine compartment, the smell of burnt diesel now mingled dangerously with the sulfuric acid of the batteries, which had begun to leak. It was a sign that something crucial had failed. Chief mechanic, the Maschinenmaat Klaus Richter, 28, clung to nothing. He was a compact force of muscle and grime, born in the shipyards of Hamburg and with a reputation aboard that was more legend than official record. While other sailors yelled and clutched at torpedo tubes, Richter was on his knees on the slick metal deck, analyzing the main ballast control system. Richter was no exemplary seaman. He had been reassigned to the U-boat fleet after repeated breaches of protocol, ranging from stealing tools from an Imperial Navy ship to creating unauthorized ventilation systems in his own cabin. But Commander Gunther Lange, captain of U-570, didn't see Klaus as a disciplinary problem. He saw him as the only reason U-570 managed a 95% operational rate on missions that would have sunk other Type VII C submarines. Lange knew that if the official manual failed, Richter would have an improvised solution. And at that exact moment, the manual was failing catastrophically. "Report, Richter." Lange barked over the voice tube, his voice tense and metallic. "The main valve panel is jammed, Herr Kalian. The shock has welded the electromagnetic relay in Section 5. We can't equalize the water in the aft ballast tanks. We're 5 degrees down by the stern and descending faster than we can pump." Richter's voice was a hoarse roar, muffled by the groans of metal bending under the pressure at 180 meters. The depth gauge needle climbed rapidly to 185 meters, 190 meters. The theoretical structural collapse depth, Quetchtief, for a Type VII C was about 280 meters, but the previous attack had already weakened the hull. The entire crew knew what was coming next. The submarine would descend until the pressure turned it into a crushed tin can. Richter ignored the voice tube and focused on what was in front of him, a tangle of electrical cables, hydraulic valves, and copper pipes. He reached for a set of wires that looked oddly different. They were thicker, their insulation rougher, and the way they were connected to the emergency ballast flooding system was completely non-standard. This was the Richter bypass, or, as the sailors at the Lariang base secretly called it, the illegal mod. Officially, the ballast system was strictly controlled by the central control panel, using standard 20-amp relays. If the panel was hit, manual control was slow, complex, and required the crew to turn massive valves in conditions of low visibility and panic. But during a long Arctic patrol, Richter had disassembled a cabin heating system, reused its high-amperage cables, and, most importantly, installed a 50-amp relay that he had borrowed from a shore power station, wiring it directly to the solenoids of the ballast valves. This allowed him, in the event of a main panel failure, to apply brute power directly to the emergency valves, forcing them to open or close instantly. It was the sort of survival engineering act that ignored every Vorschrift regulation, yet functioned with brutal efficiency. Commander Lange had ordered him to remove it months earlier, citing the risk of overload. Richter had simply smiled, agreed, and hid it better, knowing that one day German bureaucracy would be crushed by the reality of the Atlantic. The third depth charge exploded off the starboard side. This time, the impact was more lateral and devastating. The emergency lights flickered, and U-570 groaned like a dying beast. The stern dropped abruptly, plunging to 200 meters. Richter knew he had only 60 seconds before the hull began to fail permanently. He pulled an insulated screwdriver from an improvised sheath on his belt, and with frightening agility, began exposing the terminals of the Richter bypass, completely ignoring the energized wires buzzing with irregular electricity. He had two options: follow emergency protocol, trying to turn the ballast valves manually, which would take long enough for the U-boat to reach 250 meters and implode. Use the illegal mod, forcing the relay, risking a total battery short circuit, which would mean losing all electrical power to the electric motors and becoming inert on the ocean floor, but saving immediate depth control. The third explosion had taken the protocol option off the table. Time had run out. U-570 was now in a free-fall descent. Harvester was about to make its next attack run. Richter had to choose: total overload or an ocean grave. To hell with Vorschriften. He growled and flipped the illegal bypass. The resulting spark in the engine room was a blinding blue-white flash. The sound was like a train circuit breaker tripping, and for one terrifying moment, U-570 went completely dark. But the aft ballast valves, stuck from the shock, began to move. They opened with a metallic groan, releasing emergency ballast water. The stern stopped sinking. U-570 stopped its fall, oscillating dangerously at 205 meters depth. The submarine's life now depended on how long Richter could keep the electrical system pressurized before it literally melted, and whether the captain could trust that the imminent depth charges wouldn't undo the brutal work he had just performed. The total darkness aboard U-570 lasted only 7 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. The silence that followed the 50-amp spark was even more terrifying than the noise of the previous depth charges. The only source of light was the faint greenish glow of the ballast pressure gauges and Klaus Richter's emergency pulse flashlight. 318 hours. U-570 was stabilized at 205 meters. Power. We need power. Laungner roared, the sheer urgency breaking the silence. Richter, barely breathing, was already back to work. The illegal bypass had saved the submarine from a freefall by forcing the ballast to empty. But the short circuit had disabled all auxiliary circuits, and the improvised relay was smoking, its rubber insulation melting and giving off a sharp smell of burning plastic in the already heavy atmosphere. Aft ballast equalized, Herr Kalian, Richter reported, his voice tense. But we've lost the main lighting circuit and the ventilation line. The central panel is charred. We're running on emergency batteries and losing amperage fast. The Type VII C was powered on the surface by 2 manned diesel engines and submerged by 2 AEG electric motors, fed by 62 massive battery cells occupying the lower central hull. The integrity of those batteries was the life of the submarine underwater. Richter knew he couldn't trust the main batteries. The electrical shock and the force of the depth charges had already caused visible electrolyte leaks, which were running along the metal floor. He used his insulated screwdriver to disconnect the bypass, literally cutting the high-amp cable. We have to isolate the damaged cells, Richter told his assistant, young Hans, whose face was pale with fear. If sulfuric acid comes into contact with salt water, we're going to have toxic gas. Quick, give me the cloths and the rubber tape. Survival engineering. In shipyards, engineers were taught to replace damaged cells under ideal conditions. In the middle of the Atlantic, 205 meters down, with a destroyer hunting them, the only option was improvised damage control. Richter used pieces of vulcanized rubber and cleaning cloths to try to seal the leaking battery box junctions. It was a desperate measure to buy minutes, but it bought time for their escape. In the control room, Commander Lange was watching the sonar data. The hydrophone team, despite the internal noise, managed to detect the unmistakable sound. "He's turning," whispered the hydrophone operator. "The captain is coming back." 15 knots. He knows we're here. 0320 hours. The HMS Harvester, commanded by a veteran U-boat hunter, knew that sudden silence did not mean they had sunk the target. It meant the target was damaged, immobile, and waiting. A destroyer's standard tactic was clear. If a submarine stopped moving and went silent, they bombarded it until it was forced to surface or crushed. Lange looked at the depth gauge. The external pressure on the hull was 20 atmospheres. "Richter, engine status. We need to move, or it'll kill us on the next pass." Lange ordered. "Engines at half power, Herr Kalin. If we push full power, we overload the electric motors with the little energy we have left and burn what remains of the batteries. We can make 2 knots, Max, but we have to go deeper." The tactical decision was now a brutal dilemma. Option 1. Slow escape. Try to pull away from Harvester at 2 knots, using the electric motors at the limit, hoping the destroyer would pass over them before dropping the next depth charge. The risk: Harvester getting a perfect sonar lock and striking U-570 precisely. Option 2. Rapid silent dive. Descend even further, sacrificing control, hoping the Quetchtief would kill them before the depth charges did. Water pressure would increase with every meter, but maybe the greater depth could obscure the sonar signature from the destroyer. Lange glanced at the tactical clock. 322 hours. The sound of Harvester's propellers was becoming sharper, growing from a distant hum to an underwater roar. The next attack would be in less than 90 seconds. "Richter," Lange said, his voice now cold and controlled, accepting imminent death. "What depth can your mod give us before the hull fails completely?" Richter paused his work on the batteries, crucial for locomotion, and looked at the captain. He couldn't lie. The hull was groaning dangerously at 205 meters. "The collapse limit is near, but we can go deeper if we make one final adaptation. The aft ballast compensation system is still compromised. We have to use the fuel tank as extra ballast. It's not permitted by the manual, but it will take us downward faster. This will contaminate the fuel and reduce our range by 50%, but it'll give us another 50 meters. Contaminating the fuel meant that even if they survived the attack, they would have only half the range to return to occupied France. It was a life-or-death gamble, trading mission success for survival. Lange nodded, the decision made. The mission was lost. The submarine had to live. "Do it, Richter. Contaminate the fuel. Dive to 250 meters. Silent power mode. Now!" Richter moved with the cold precision of a machine surgeon. He accessed a rarely used valve that separated the ballast tank from the diesel reserve fuel tank. In less than 30 seconds, he was draining heavy fuel into the aft ballast system, adding instant weight, a survival engineering maneuver strictly prohibited. U-570 began to dive again. 210 meters, 220 meters. The crushing pressure showed in the strain of the rivets. And in the hydrophone, the sound of Harvester's propellers was deafening. The depth charges were on the way. 324 hours. The fate of U-570 was sealed. They were at 225 meters depth, moving at 1.5 knots with contaminated fuel, leaking batteries, and a destroyer directly above them, ready to unleash a curtain of death. The emergency dive to 250 meters wasn't a tactic. It was surrender to pressure. As U-570 slid into dangerous depths, the crew heard the ominous click. 324 hours. HMS Harvester launched its second wave of depth charges. 6 bombs arranged in a hexagonal pattern aimed to cover the zone where sonar suggested the submarine lay inert. Inside U-570, now at 235 meters, the weight was excruciating. Men held their breath, The air grew denser, hotter, and saturated with the stench of diesel and sulfuric acid. The first impact of the new wave was different. Instead of a single loud bang, the pressure from the explosions above sent a shockwave that literally whipped the hull. It sounded less like an explosion and more like metal being torn apart. Seconds later, the forward compartment reported a minor flood. Compartment 1, leak at upper gasket. Minor, sealing the section, the torpedo officer shouted. Commander Lang's eyes stayed fixed on the stopwatch. The destroyer was making another pass. Under normal conditions, the U-boat would have been obliterated. But the desperate dive and the contaminated fuel ballast, courtesy of Richter's illegal mod, had dropped the submarine into exactly the right place. 250 meters. 326 hours. U to 570 reached 250 meters. At that depth, the U-boat entered a phenomenon known in anti-submarine warfare as a thermal layer. The North Atlantic, at that time of year, formed a stratification where colder, denser water met the warmer surface water. This thermal interface was ideal for scattering British ASDIC sonar pulses. The destroyer was tracking a sonic ghost, the U-boat's echo, refracted and displaced by the temperature gradient. Aboard Harvester, the sonar operator was confused. No solid contact, Captain. Just dot static. It must have sunk or broken up. Commander Lange seized the hesitation. Speed 1.5 knots. Maintain 250 meters. Heading 270 degrees. We're crawling out of here. U-570 was now in extreme survival mode. The sacrifice of reserve fuel had been the key. But survival came with an immediate cost, the instability of the emergency batteries. Klaus Richter was racing against time to bring critical systems back online. The wires he had used in the illegal mod, though now disconnected, had generated so much heat that nearby junction boxes were badly damaged. He faced a technical dilemma: restore propulsion or air filtration. Without propulsion, they would eventually be found. Without air filtration, the sulfuric acid fumes and rising CO2 levels would kill the crew before oxygen ran out. Oxygen wasn't the immediate threat. Toxicity was. The Type VII C was equipped to manage CO2 buildup, but not the chemical cocktail Richter had inadvertently created in the battery room. 330 hours. A sailor coughed violently in the torpedo compartment, a dry, guttural sound. Silent panic began to spread. Richter looked at the wires. He needed power for the air filters, but restarting the forced ventilation would require an amperage spike that could overload the emergency relay, still powering the slow propulsion motors. He grabbed a piece of raw copper wire he had stolen from an auxiliary generator in Lorient. Hans, hold this terminal here. I need a temporary bridge to the emergency fan. It'll be a jump start. If we screw it up, we'll fry the circuit. A manual jump start in a submarine at 250 meters was madness. But it was the only way to bypass the damaged panel and start the fan. Richter, acting on adrenaline and years of gut-level familiarity with the boat's guts, ignored the risk of electrocution. He touched the copper wire to the correct terminals. Another quick flash, smaller this time, but enough to trigger the fan. 332 hours. Harvester had completed its sweep and was pulling away, convinced it had sunk the target. U to 570 was barely alive, but alive. Survival, however, came with a new list of technical compromises that turned the vessel into a ghost ship. They were 250 meters deep, lights flickering, fuel half-contaminated, and worst of all, the water heating system was completely inoperative due to electrical damage. Richter knew the escape was over. The real battle was just beginning. Long-term survival engineering in a crippled and freezing hull. If they didn't restore some basic warmth and power, hypothermia and panic would kill them long before they reached the French coast. He needed a plan for the next phase of the war, the long crawl back through 300 miles of open ocean. Commander Longnau was at the radio. trying to send a brief coded report. U-570 damaged. Extreme dive. Low range. Survival due to unauthorized modification. Richter, meanwhile, was already back in the engine room, staring at the modified ballast system. He was searching for the next illegal mod that would keep them alive. He needed heat. And he knew exactly where to get it, by once again breaking every rule in the manual 400 hours. U-570 was now at 240 meters, moving at barely 1 knot to conserve the last of its damaged battery power. The combat tension had faded, replaced by a paralyzing cold. At that depth, North Atlantic water held a constant temperature of 4 degrees Celsius. And with the electric heating system fried in the short circuit, the submarine's interior was rapidly matching the external chill. Cold was the silent enemy. In a confined space, hypothermia wasn't just discomfort. It led to mental sluggishness, calculation errors, and ultimately, a complete collapse of will. The crew, already exhausted and breathing stale air, began to shiver uncontrollably. Droplets of condensation formed on the metal walls and dripped onto the men. In the engine room, Richter stared at what remained of the left diesel engine, shut down and sealed. Diesel engines couldn't be used underwater. They needed air, and the U-boat had to surface. But if electric heating was dead, Richter had to find an alternative heat source, fast. The solution came from an unexpected place, the compressed air system. Over years of service, Richter had noticed that the high-pressure ballast compressor, used to purge tanks rapidly at the surface, generated considerable residual heat on its casing, even in short bursts. The plan was bold, illegal, and dangerous. He would build an improvised diesel heater using the compressor's residual heat and a controlled trickle of contaminated fuel. 415 hours. Richter gathered a team of mechanics and spoke in a low voice. "We'll pulse the ballast compressor for 30 seconds at a time. It'll get hot. We'll reroute the lubricant output to the water cooling coil and use it as a makeshift heat exchanger. I need a copper tube and a backup oil pump." Survival engineering at its extreme. He was essentially turning the compression system into a cabin heater, using high-pressure friction heat and repurposing the oil pump to distribute that heat crudely, like an improvised radiator. The key component of this hack was a 10-foot copper pipe, about 3 meters, that Richter had stolen from a spare parts warehouse back in 1942, claiming it was for future plumbing repairs. In truth, he used it to warm his food during long trips by attaching it to a steam vent. Richter and his team worked in intense, focused silence for 45 minutes, bending the stolen copper pipe around the compressor and redirecting the oil output. 450 hours. The first test. Compressor on. 30 seconds. Max pressure. The compressor roared in the engine room. U-570 shuddered from the internal noise. A serious risk of sonar detection if Harvester was nearby, but a calculated gamble. Inactivity and cold would kill the crew either way. At the end of the 30 seconds, Richter felt the copper pipe. It was warm. He opened the cooling valve and slowly, water began to circulate. It wasn't the cozy heat of the original electric system, but it was tangible warmth. "We're gaining 2 degrees in the engine compartment, Herr Kallian," Richter reported, eyes gleaming with exhaustion and triumph. Commander Lange, hearing the news, felt a wave of relief that surpassed any tactical concern. Morale was everything. "Keep it running in short cycles, Richter. Use the compressed air sparingly. We'll need it to surface if we're forced up." U-570 continued its slow crawl westward. The return journey would take twice as long due to the need to ration the contaminated fuel. They would have to stay submerged most of the time, surfacing only briefly to recharge the batteries. The U-boat had become a survival capsule, dependent entirely on unauthorized modifications. The illegal mod, which had saved the submarine by forcing the ballast open, now had a counterpart in Richter's compressor heater, which was keeping the crew from freezing and shutting down. The Kriegsmarine's technical manual mentioned neither, but they were the only reason 45 men were still alive, 300 nautical miles from home. The next phase of the journey would be the hardest: weeks of silence, darkness, and the constant threat of Allied patrols. And for Richter, the challenge was to ensure the contaminated diesel wouldn't destroy the engine when they finally surfaced to recharge. He would need one last act of extreme engineering to clean the fuel system, an act that could explode the engine during ignition. The next 17 days were a slow torture of darkness, cold, and the lingering stench of oil and nausea. U-570 avoided known shipping lanes, crawling eastward at an average speed of 1.2 knots, relying on Richter's compressor cycles to keep internal temperatures at a barely tolerable 10 degrees Celsius. The final challenge came on the night of July 29, 1943. The U-boat, with its batteries nearly drained, needed to surface to recharge using the diesel engines before reaching the Bay of Biscay. 2,345 hours. July 29, 1943. Commander Lung, he gave the order to surface. In the engine room, Klaus Richter faced his greatest challenge yet. The diesel fuel, contaminated with seawater, sludge, and metal debris from the ballast tank, had become a viscous, dangerous substance. If Langa tried to start the engines with that fuel, it would blow the injection pumps or crack the pistons. Richter had worked feverishly for days, developing an emergency filtration solution. He used old wool socks and compressed felt, mounting them into the fuel filtration system, turning what had once been a simple injection line into a multi-stage sediment filter. But he still had to ensure the engine would start without failure. Surfacing and failing to recharge would mean being struck by Allied aircraft at dawn. So Richter implemented his final modification. He used the residual heat from the improvised compressor heater to pre-warm a small batch of the contaminated diesel, making it less viscous and easier to pump into the engine. He was essentially distilling the lightest, most usable part of the fuel at the exact moment of ignition. 5 hours, July 30th, 1943. U-570 broke the surface. The night air rushed into the hull, a blessing after weeks of stale atmosphere. Start diesel engines, Lange ordered, heart pounding. One engine coughed. The right engine, which Richter hadn't focused on, failed. But the left engine, the one linked to the copper pipe heating system, sputtered, choked, and finally came to life. The smoke from its exhaust was thick and black, smelling of scorched tar and salt, but it was running. The engine was alive, charging the batteries. Klaus Richter and U-570 had survived. U-570 reached the naval base in Lorient. 3 days later, on August 2, 1943, the boat was in terrible condition. Its hull dented and electrical systems wrecked, but all 45 crewmen were alive. The official report on the incident cited severe damage from depth charges and crew ingenuity under duress. Klaus Richter's modifications, the 50 AMP illegal bypass, the fuel ballast hack, and the copper compressor heater, were immediately removed and logged as evidence of non-standard operational practices. His survival engineering had saved the U-boat and its crew, but would never be added to the Kriegsmarine manual. Richter was awarded a second-class Iron Cross for his bravery in the engine room, but was never promoted beyond Maschinenmaat. The officer corps viewed his genius as a threat to discipline. U-570 was repaired and returned to service, but the illegal mod was never seen again. The story of Klaus Richter and so many other survival engineers of World War II proves that war wasn't won only by generals and strategists, but by those who deep inside machines used raw improvisational skill to defy the rules of physics, the manual, and imminent death. If this story moved you, don't just click away. Hit like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear about technical brilliance under pressure. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Are you in the US, Australia, Brazil, or somewhere in Europe? Our community spans the globe, and together, we're preserving these memories so they're never lost. Men like Klaus Richter did their duty in 1943. Ours is to remember. Never forget.